Good evening and welcome to JWA's Quarantine-ish Book Talks. I'm Judith Rosenbaum of the Jewish Women's Archive. I'm really happy to be back with you here tonight. If you are new to JWA and to our Quarantine Book Talks, thank you for joining us. If you've been with us before over this past year, more than a year now, of weekly programs, welcome back. Please introduce yourself in the chat. Make sure to chat to panelists and attendees so we can all see your name and where you are. And also, please add your questions to the conversation as we continue. Today, as many of you probably know, was Yom HaAtzmaut, Israeli Independence Day. So it feels like a fitting opportunity to explore a work of Israeli literature with one of the foremost literary translators of modern Hebrew literature. I will say that often the modern state of Israel is viewed really only through the lens of politics, but I believe that the revival of the Hebrew language and the richness and complexity of Israeli literature are among the great gifts and innovations of modern Zionism. And Israeli culture, I think, actually offers a very important lens through which we can complicate and add nuance to the current political debate. So tonight we are happy to lift up the voice of Israeli author Ronit Matalon, who sadly died in 2017 at age 58, and of her translator, Jessica Cohen, whom we are delighted to have with us here tonight. And I will introduce Jessica now. Jessica Cohen is a literary translator who has translated works by authors including David Grossman, Amos Oz, Edgar Keret, Dorit Rabinyan, whose book All the Rivers was a JWA book pick in 2017, Nir Baram, and Ronit Matalon. Jessica shared the 2017 Man Booker International Prize with author David Grossman for her translation of A Horse Walks into a Bar. Born in the UK, raised in Israel, she currently is joining us from Denver. Welcome, Jessica. We're so glad to have you here with us tonight.
Hi, thank you, Judith, and thanks, Betsy, and thank you to all of you for being here. It's really great to be here, and it's nice to see people from all over. So, yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
So maybe start by telling us a little bit about your story. It's not everybody who grows up to think I'm going to be a translator. So how did you come to find yourself in this particular role?
Yeah, I also did not grow up thinking I was going to be a translator. And I think few people do. You know, if you took a room full of translators, you would probably not get the same story twice. At least in kind of my generation and above, everyone seems to have fallen into translation from just different backgrounds, different jobs, life stories. It's more common now for people to go to a program to study translation and have kind of more of a purposeful way of doing that. But for me, as you mentioned, I was born in England. When I was about 7.5, we made Aliyah, we moved to Israel. I did not speak a word of Hebrew when I moved there, neither did anyone in my family. And so I was forced to learn Hebrew pretty quickly. I just went to a regular Israeli Hebrew-speaking school. Didn't open my mouth for about 6 months, and when I did, what came out was almost fluent Hebrew. And so I grew up bilingually. We always spoke English at home. I always read in English, but the rest of my life was in Hebrew. And I'll give you kind of the short version of the story. I moved to the States in '97 after I finished college. And I still didn't know what I wanted to do. And purely by dumb luck, I got a job actually in Microsoft. I was living in Seattle at the time. They were looking for someone to translate software localization, it's called. And so I did that for a while, and that was the first time I'd really worked in translation. And I then built up a freelance translation business where I didn't do any literary translation. I translated, instruction manuals and apartment leases and advertising and, all kinds of stuff. And I began to translate literature really just for the joy of it, just kind of playing around with it. I would read things that I liked that were coming out in Israel that weren't available in English yet, and tried to see, well, can I do this in English? And gradually the hobby overtook the other parts of my professional life. And I went to grad school. I got a certificate of literary translation. I was mentored by a really good translator there. And for quite a few years, I did both commercial kinds of translation and literary. And for the last several years, so that's really mostly what I've done, is just fiction, some nonfiction. I sometimes work with filmmakers, but all kinds of creative work. So that's kind of the short version of how I got into it.
I'm still muted. It's been more than a year and I still forget to unmute myself. It's unbelievable. You know, I always think of the work of translation as this incredibly delicate art that I'm sort of in awe of, you know, sort of having to balance the intent of the author with your own literary skill. And I'm curious how you think about your role in translation, both in terms of what the actual process is for you, and also whether you think of your translation as a new work of literature, or how you think of the relationship of your work to the work that you're translating.
Yeah, I think my view of that has evolved over the years. I mean, I've been doing this for about 20 years now, a little more. And when I started off, I was very kind of reverential towards the original text, the author. And I think that as a result, my translations probably were not as good as they are now, because over the years, I've learned to gain more distance from the original text and to take more ownership over the translation. And I do view myself as a writer now. I'm writing books in English that someone has already kind of done the heavy lifting of, you know, thinking of the plot, the characters, the continuity, all that stuff that I don't have the desire or the skills to do. What I do love doing is writing, is playing with language, is, you know, looking for the perfect word, and that's what I get to do. And I do think it is authorship, and it is writing a new work of literature in some ways, which of course is derivative of the original. And yeah, I think it is a process that one has to go through. You know, I do sometimes meet with and mentor up and coming translators, and I always I'm never sure whether I should tell them this or not, because I do think, you know, the better translations are the ones that take more liberties and stray further from the original text. But that's something that you have to learn how to do the hard way. You have to go through that experience of gaining that confidence and saying, okay, I am the author of this new book, and this is how I think it should sound in English. So that's kind of where I am now with the way I view the works I translate.
And what is your process like?
That also has changed a little bit, but I always read a book before I even agree to translate it. Some translators do not. Some translators intentionally don't read a book before they've done it, because they feel that kind of replicates the experience of the reader if they're translating it as, you know, reading it as they go along in the translation. For me, that really wouldn't work. I like to know what I'm getting into. I like to be able to kind of start thinking about things in a general sense before I really sat down to translate it. So reading is the first stage. And then I generally do a very, very rough draft, which I kind of try to get through as fast as I can. And I view that as kind of my raw material. So I'll, you know, leave lots of question marks, lots of parentheses. I don't kind of get stuck for too long on things I'm not sure about. I just move on and leave things marked. And then when I do my second draft, I put the original away, and I really don't look at it unless there's something very specific that I'm not sure about, or I think I might have missed or done wrong. And that second draft is where I really, really work things and, you know, take this kind of Hebrew in English piece and try to make it really English. Like, what would this sound like if the author had written it in English? And that's where I work a lot on language. I do research that always needs to be done. I start to figure out, you know, how am I going to address these cultural concepts or names that English language readers are not going to be familiar with. All of those decisions I make in that draft. And I usually end up with a list of questions for the author at that point, which I will then discuss ideally in person if we're in the same country. If not, then email and phone and WhatsApp and whatever. And I get those clarifications, I work them into the text. I do another draft where I'm just polishing things up even more. And then I do compare and go back to the original, and if I have time, which I don't always, but ideally I really compare everything side by side, because, you know, it happens that you miss something, you misread something, and that needs to be done. And then my very final stage, which is actually a piece of advice that David Grossman gave me once, is to read the text out loud, ideally in a different setting. So I don't generally print things out because, you know, we're not supposed to print everything nowadays. So, but I will either transfer it to my Kindle or just use like a different font, or just in some ways make it look different so that it feels fresher when you're reading it. I'll sometimes go and do it in a different room from where I normally work, and I read the text out loud, and it's amazing how many things you catch when you do that, both in terms of little typos or other errors, and just, you know, do things sound good, because a lot of times I think good writing has some musicality. It's not just about what is being said, but how it's being said, and I want to try and capture that in English. And it's when you hear the words, that's when you can really do that.
It sounds like quite a long process. How and what happens if you can't be in touch with the author? Like if the author has passed away, how does that change your process?
Yeah, I find that really, really difficult. You know, with Ronit, for example, with Ronit Matalon, well, I should say that actually the very first book that I ever translated was hers. It was a book that in Hebrew was called Sarah, Sarah, but in English the title was Bliss, and that came out in 2003, I believe. So that was the very first book I was given to translate through her agent. And, you know, I was brand new, I was young, I didn't really know what I was doing. I had terrible imposter syndrome. I was just like, you know, how could they let me do this book? I don't know what I'm doing. And I remember going to meet her in Tel Aviv because I happened to be visiting there. And she, you know, like many authors, had already moved on to other work. And it was really hard for her to kind of delve back into what she'd done with this book I was translating. So I remember she was kind of like, you know, if you have specific questions, I'll try and help you, but otherwise just do what you need to do. You know, she wasn't all that enthusiastic about being part of it, which some authors are, some are not. It just really depends. And then with this book, and The Bride Closed the Door, I did have time to correspond with her about the translation just really shortly before she died. But yeah, it's for me, kind of having that access to the author is a big part of my work and why I like my work. I feel really lucky and privileged to be able to meet these great writers and talk to them and get their perspective on why they write the way they do and what they're trying to say in the book. For me, that's like a really valuable part of what I do. And I feel that a piece is missing when it's an author who isn't alive or who I'm not able to access. I mean, authors who are alive, I can pretty much always get in touch with, because it's Israel, it's a small world, everyone knows everyone, which is not the case when things are going the other direction, I should say. So, you know, I have colleagues in Israel who translate into Hebrew, say, you know, famous American writers. Well, they could only dream of going to have coffee with, you know, whichever writer they're translating. They're always so jealous that I get to sit down with my writers pretty much whenever I want to.
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about that piece.
Yeah.
It's interesting to me too that you say that some people choose a book before they've read it. I can't imagine embarking on that kind of project with a text that you didn't feel drawn to. How do you choose which projects you work on? Is it more about the author you want to work with, or the text itself?
Yeah, I share your sentiment. I don't know how anyone could sit down with text that they've agreed to translate without knowing it yet. I am very lucky to be able to be quite, you know, choosy about what texts I take. I wouldn't say that I have to absolutely love every book I translate, but I need to feel some affinity with the book, with even just one of the characters, with a theme. There's got to be something there, a hook that for me is a connection, or is kind of a road into the text. But generally speaking, I would say it's about good writing. Now, that's subjective, obviously, but I find it really, really difficult to translate poor writing, because then before you can even start translating it, you have to kind of take things apart and figure out, well, what's actually going on here? And, you know, the better the writing is, the easier my job is. So that's probably my first criterion is, you know, is the craft good? Is there an attention to the language, the way things are structured. I think there are a lot of Israeli writers, well, a lot of writers in general, but I've noticed it more in among Israeli writers who have fantastic ideas and themes and stories, and the raw material and the energy is there, but they don't necessarily have the discipline to turn that into a really good piece of writing, and work it over and over and over again, which good writers do. Someone like David Grossman, he will do dozens and dozens of drafts on a book. And when I say drafts, I don't mean tinkering on the word processor, like actual new drafts that he starts from scratch. And it's very evident in his writing. When I talk to him and ask questions about a book, there is not a single comma in there that he couldn't tell me, this is why it's here. This is why I chose this word and not that word. It's very intentional and very careful. And those are the kinds of things that I enjoy translating.
And, you mentioned that you translate lots of different kinds of things, including obviously fiction, but also nonfiction and even some screenplays. Is it a different process depending on what kind of work it is, or does it not actually matter so much whether it's fiction or nonfiction or the format it takes?
For nonfiction, there isn't a huge difference for me in terms of the process I go through. With films, my main experience working with screenplays is with Ari Folman, who many of you might have heard of. He made the film Waltz with Bashir, which was hugely popular. And he now makes his films in English, but he writes the screenplays in Hebrew. But we've had kind of a collaborative process where he doesn't just send me a document and I translate it, but we kind of have worked things together with my input and him revising as we go along, which can sometimes be a huge headache, but it's also really fun. And I feel very lucky to have that experience. So that's a whole different way of working. But for the most part, when it's a written literary text, the process is pretty similar for me.
And do you ever translate English to Hebrew?
I don't. I used to, when I did commercial translation of technical things, I did, but I was always slower doing it that way, and I didn't feel as confident. And with literary translation, I would never do that. Even though I grew up mostly in Israel, and I now do read a lot in Hebrew, and my Hebrew is perfectly fluent. I don't have the nuances. I just, sometimes when I do have to write in Hebrew and I want it to be, something where I'm really trying to express myself more than just, a text message, I find it quite frustrating because I just can feel that I'm not as articulate as I can be in English. So I could not do
that. Let's turn our attention to Ronit Matalon's book. I have lots of other questions about translation, and maybe we'll get to some of them later, but I want to make sure we have a little bit of time to talk about this book as well. So Ronit Matalon's book, And the Bride Closed the Door, was published in Hebrew in 2016. Your translation, I believe, was published in 2019. And the book won the prestigious Brenner Prize in Israeli Literature, actually, I believe, one day before Matalon's untimely death, very sadly.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, for those of you who haven't read it yet, I recommend it. It's funny, it's tragic, it's a very short book, almost a novella, about a bride who barricades herself in her bedroom on her wedding day, and it's really about the kind of machinations of her family to try to coax her out. Jessica, do you want to read a little bit for us to give us a taste of the work?
Yeah, I'd love to. So I'll just read really just a couple lines in Hebrew, just to give you a taste of it. Even those of you who don't speak Hebrew, you might enjoy hearing it. And then I'll read a short chapter in English. עכשיו נשא מתי את מבטו והביט באי אמון בדלת. רצה לדפוק שוב וידו נשארה תלויה באוויר זמן מה. מהסלון ומהמטבח נשמע קולה של נדיה, גבוה וכמעט צווחני, משקר בטלפון. לא, מרגי בסדר. קצת לא מרגישה טוב. כן, נתתי לה אקמול. היא יושנת קצת, כן. אמרתי לה שתישן קצת. שיהיה לה כוח בערב. English. Matty looked at the door mistrustfully, wanting to knock again, but his hand remained suspended in midair for a while. From the living room or the kitchen, he heard Nadia's voice, high-pitched and almost screechy, lying on the phone. No, Margie's fine. Fine. She's a little bit under the weather. Yes, I gave her an aspirin. She's laying down. Yes, I told her to lay down a while so she'll get her strength back this evening. His stomach started murmuring, contracting and dizzying in ominous swirls, and he abandoned the door and ran to the toilet. There, with his thighs on the seat that felt cool and calming, he found himself preoccupied by counting the blue porcelain tiles on the wall over the bathtub. He got mixed up and started over again, wondering if he should begin with the row of tiles at his eye level or at the top row, where the shower head protruded. As he voided himself and simultaneously counted and recounted the tiles, there began to arise in his mind, level upon level, a structure that was both paralyzed and paralyzing, which he called the practical aspect of the situation, or rather the long and bothersome line that represented its various embodiments. First, his parents, then the wedding hall that had been booked and the wedding hall's owner, the large financial deposit his parents had given the owner, the hundreds of guests who couldn't possibly be notified of the wedding's cancellation, the photographer they'd paid in advance, the band, the bed and breakfast that had been reserved in the Galilee for that night, the decorated car, not his, a friend from work, and various other tedious details that branched out from these. For some reason, the image now branded in his mind, he zipped up his pants and buckled his belt, was of Gramsci, and it popped out and rose up insistently from the crowded mass of anxieties and tasks. Her radiant yet absent face, an absence that, strangely, was extremely full and not at all a void. The fold at the bottom of her chin that touched the collar of her festive white dress, which sat quietly in its place, wondrously and innocently unknowing, and which almost brought tears to Matty's eyes at this moment. He went back to the shut door, infused with a surprising energy derived from the memory of that white collar, and knocked firmly. Margie, he called. He waited a moment and added a note of charm to his voice. Honey, answer me. Say something. He heard a rustle in the room from behind the door, or at least he thought he did. There was a sound that resembled padding feet, followed by silence. Margie, he tried again, fixing his look on the door's smooth brown veneer. But he could feel the desire and the capacity to produce words dying inside him, rotting right in front of his eyes with astounding speed, like summer fruit in a bowl. He looked away from the door, and his eyes wandered down the dark hallway to his right, finally settling on a framed tapestry of 3 roses, embroidered in faded red, that hung on the wall. Is this because of what happened last night, Margie? That we fought yesterday? But we made up in the end. That's what I can't understand. When I left you at night, we made up and everything was okay. And you walked me to the car, and then you ran and woke up Yaron to get his cables because my car wouldn't start. So what happened? What happened since then? Would you please come out of there and tell me what exactly I'm supposed to do now? Margie, do you hear me? Do you want this to end up with a locksmith? Do we have to get a locksmith here to break open the door? Is it going to end up with a locksmith? I demand that you come out now and tell me to my face what you want to say. To my face. I have a right to know. Do you hear me? It's my right to at least hear it from you. Can you even imagine what I'm feeling right now? Do you even care what I'm going through with this whole mess you've made? He spun around and leaned his back against the door, his knees slightly bent from weakness. I'm thinking over what happened, and I can't understand it, he went on. I can't. Not that I understood your reaction yesterday, but by the end of it, I didn't care that I couldn't understand, because we made up. But could you maybe explain to me what that fight was about? What were we fighting about? You sat there for 2 hours without saying anything. 2 hours, with a face like someone died or was sick or something, until you finally said something. I didn't get it, and I don't get it now either. How someone can go off the deep end like that, but at least you said something. And what was that all about? What? Margie, do you hear me? If I told someone what that whole thing was about, they wouldn't believe me. I swear they wouldn't. I don't believe it either when I tell it to myself. What would I say? That my girlfriend, the girl I was going to marry the next day, drove herself and me crazy because while we were watching a movie on TV about Leah Goldberg, I said it was too bad I never knew her or met her, and that maybe I would have loved her for real and been able to rescue her from that difficult life she had with men who didn't love her. That's all I said. Margie, she's dead. Leah Goldberg's been dead for years already. Do you get that? How can you throw a jealous fit over a poet who's been dead for years? And not just that, but tell me we're not right for each other and we have to call the whole thing off? Margie! He turned to the door again and pounded on it with his fists. Listen to me carefully now, because I'm only going to say this once. If you don't come out right now and talk to me, then I'm the one who doesn't want to get married, not you. Understand? I don't want to marry you. Not now, not ever. He stopped speaking, suddenly stunned by the total silence on the other side of the door. A frightened pallor washed over him all at once, galloped up from his feet to his forehead as though a solution had been injected into him. Margie, are you okay? Just tell me you're okay, Margie, are you? He leaned down to his right shin and scratched it hard as if something had stung him. He pulled his pant leg up to his knee, exposing a red, stinging rash on his skin, and kept scratching, digging his nails in until it was covered with dark red lines.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I love having a chance to hear both the Hebrew and the English. Can you say a little bit about why you picked that particular passage?
Yeah, and I realized that I didn't explain at all what was going on. I just jumped right in. So those of you who haven't read the book were probably very confused. So that's not long after the beginning of the book, though, and the book opens with a bride who is Margie, who has locked herself in her bedroom on the day of her wedding and refuses to come out. And so the groom, Matti, who we were seeing his perspective there, and Margie's mother, and then his parents turn up later. They're all in this apartment trying to figure out what's going on because she won't tell them anything. All she says is, I'm not getting married. And no one understands what's going on. And that's essentially that is the setting for the whole book. I chose that because I think actually it's a little ironic now that I think of it, because it's a woman author, and supposedly the central character is the woman, the bride. But I actually find the groom's character probably the most interesting. We get quite a lot of his perspective and his personality, which I find interesting. There's some flashbacks to what he was like when they met and started going out. And he's the most surprising character to me. He does and says things that I don't think you would expect him to do. And he is actually quite a sensitive man and is not really trying to strong arm her into anything. But, you have a lot of sympathy for this guy who's supposed to be getting married, and his bride is just not telling him what's going on and she won't come out. So yeah, I guess that's why I chose it.
He's pretty much the only one who's not trying to strong arm her.
Right. Yeah. Everyone else is just, kind of apoplectic and all kind of upset about the money and the guests and all these technicalities and just like really desperate to understand what's going on. But he seems to actually be trying to understand her because he knows her well enough to know that there must be a good reason. He doesn't know what it is, but he knows that if he kind of can figure out the right approach to take, he will understand what's going on.
It was interesting to me in the book that, as you said, the bride is sort of at the center, but we actually don't really ever hear her voice except in the first few lines where, it says that she repeats, not getting married, not getting married, not getting married. But then she's this kind of silent center of the story. And, you get the sense that she's certainly a very strong figure and that there's kind of a rebellion there, but we don't get to really have a taste of who she is or what her story is.
Yeah, and her main form of communication is through this note that she eventually slips under the door, which contains a poem, but it's not her poem exactly. It's a poem by Leah Goldberg, who was mentioned in that piece, who is considered one of the finest Hebrew language poets and one of the few prominent women poets of her generation. And the poem was written originally about a male protagonist, if a poem has a protagonist, and Margie has taken it and rewritten it in the feminine. And that's all. She doesn't explain why she wrote it. She doesn't say anything about it. She just writes out this poem adapted to a female character. And they all read it. And, Matti, again, is the only one who kind of tries to figure out, like, he knows that she's really trying to say something here, that, like, this is key. And he's trying to figure out what this is about. And as we heard in that piece I read, they had watched this film about Leah Goldberg, who did have quite a tragic life. Obviously something in the bride was kind of jolted when she watched this film about the poet, and it seems to have plunged her into some kind of crisis. And everyone else is just like, they don't even know who Leah Goldberg is. And they're kind of just like, well, what, why did she write someone else's poem? What is going on? But obviously this is a very key element because it is pretty much the only communication that we get from her in the whole book.
Yeah, I loved that kind of text within the text piece. And that was one of the questions I was thinking about, what about the role that the poem plays in the story and how you thought about this kind of textual layering. Did you have to translate Leah Goldberg's poem within the book?
I did. And I'm not a translator of poetry. I mean, I've done a little bit of it here and there, but I certainly would never have taken it upon myself to translate a classic work of Hebrew poetry. It's not at all my comfort zone. And I found a couple of translations of this poem. I didn't love either of them. So I did end up doing my own translation. And yeah, what I also try to do is figure out how likely your average Israeli reader would have been to know this poem. Because, one of the things that one tries to do in a translation is not just translate the words, but kind of the effect that they would have. And so there's this concept of thinking, well, what is the original language reader getting from this text when they read it in Hebrew? Say, what do they know or not know? If there's something that is potentially confusing or disorienting in the original, then it's all right for it to be confusing in the translation as well. But so I needed to know, because I personally did not, I went through school in Israel, as I mentioned, and I studied Leah Goldberg. I didn't have any memory of this particular poem. And I was kind of wondering, well, is this something that, people would study in high school, or is it something that only someone who maybe studied Hebrew literature in college would know, or even that not? And it's certainly not something that your average reader would be familiar with.
And it's a poem about the prodigal son. I mean, she translated it to be the prodigal daughter. So it in itself is an interpretation. It's also referring to another text, a biblical story.
Right.
So there's a lot of reworking of story and layering there.
Yeah. So that's a whole other, as you said, a whole other layer where, this borrowing from, an essential Christian tale. What is that doing here? Why is that the poem that she chose? Why is it the poem that Ronit Matalon chose?
Did you get any sense of that from Matalon? Did you discuss
that? I didn't get really to kind of sit down and talk with her about the book. I sent her a list of pretty specific questions, just textual things, did you mean this? Did you mean that? What do you think is the best translation? I didn't, as far as I recall, talk about the poem with her and why that was the choice, unfortunately.
One of the things I also found very interesting about the book is that on the one hand, it's very much about family dynamics, and it's like a very close-in portrait of family dynamics. But I think that it felt to me at least that it functions very much also like an allegory for many dynamics in Israeli society. And you see, so much of it is about space and about boundaries, and there's some hints, I think, in there about tensions between Ashkenazi and Mizrahi Israelis, and there's obviously tensions between Israeli and Palestinians that shows up there. And Matalon herself was a kind of unusual voice in Israeli literature, at least in the Israeli literature that we get in English, right? In that she's a woman and she's Mizrahi, she's from an Egyptian Israeli family. So I'm curious sort of how you saw that part of her background potentially coming through in the text, or whether, how you thought about her authorial voice and the way that it played out in the shape of the story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, Ronit was a very complicated writer and a complicated identity, I think she had. And that does play out in her writing. But I personally, I'm wary of reading too much political interpretation into a book or allegory. It's certainly there, and I wouldn't deny that it is. But I think also because of the way I translate, because of my relationship with the book, I'm very close to the book kind of on a micro level. I'm looking at words and sentences, And I often get to the point where it's really difficult for me to step back and take a larger view of what this book is saying and where it is positioned in Israeli literature or culture. So I don't know that I really can say, especially because I didn't really get the chance to talk to her about this, whether or not she intended this as an allegory. I think that layer is definitely there. And, you know, I guess I would argue that if a reader finds something in a book, then it's there, whether or not the author intended it to be. And in this case, yes, I think clearly, you know, most Israeli readers would pick up on the fact that the bride's family is Mizrahi and the groom's family is probably Ashkenazi. Whether or not that would be something that American or English readers would pick up on, you know, I don't know. Probably not if they're not very familiar with Israel. So that's certainly in there, and that was something that preoccupied Ronit a lot, and she has written some nonfiction pieces about that too. She also actually, I translated a nonfiction, an essay that she wrote about the presence of Arabic in Hebrew writing. That's really interesting. It's a very kind of dense, thought-provoking piece. It was very difficult to translate, actually, also because it was talking about, you know, Hebrew and Arabic and trying to convey that in English. So it was quite challenging. But some of the ideas that I think you get a hint of in her fiction writing were really spelled out in this piece.
Right, and sort of what the book ends without a real resolution, but it ends with this Arabic song that, you know, first of all, is one of the ways that it sort of confirms that there is this that the bride's family is probably Mizrahi, but also, you know, that kind of provides this closing moment, and she brings in the words of the song.
Yeah, and it's you know, it's actually a really sad book, although there is humor in it, and even it's kind of farcical in some places. It's a very sad book, I find it. There's a lot of sadness in the family's history that we get little pieces of. There, you know, at some point we discovered there was another sister, or that the bride had a sister who disappeared or perhaps died. We're not really sure what happened. And so there's this sense of mourning. And I think that is something that's also reflected in the Goldberg poem and in that Arabic song at the end. And, you know, here we are on what's supposed to be a wedding day. It should be, you know, this joyous occasion. But really what we get is a lot of sadness and grief.
Right. Yes, that definitely came through strongly to me as well. But I think this question about, as you were saying, about Arabic and Hebrew, and you know, one of the things that I was thinking about in terms of translation is that your work helps to bridge cultures. It gives people around the world access to Israeli literature, and it also means that you have to explain things that may not be obvious to people, or figure out, as you said earlier, sort of how much was meant to be obvious to the reader but wouldn't be obvious to another reader. So, you know, how do you think about that? Do you think of yourself as a kind of cultural translator, and how do you deal with specificity of references or with things that just don't translate, as it were?
Yeah, I mean, I guess in some ways I am de facto kind of an ambassador of sorts for Israeli literature, but that's not what I set out to be. It's not my goal. It's kind of like what I was saying before. I'm in a much smaller place when I'm translating a book. It's me and the book, and the words. But in a more kind of, you know, specific way, when there are terms that I know an English language reader is not going to know, and that happens in every single book, I don't really have, you know, a rule of thumb. It's really a case-by-case basis. It very much depends on whether the term is something that appears a lot in the book, and so I really have to find a solution for it. Sometimes if it's something that, you know, isn't all that crucial and I really do not have a parallel, I may drop it. But, you know, I will check with the author before I would do something like that. Then there's something that in the translation world we refer to as stealth glossing. So you figure out a way to gloss a term that is not noticeable, ideally. So it's very difficult to do in dialogue. because you want people to sound natural, and no one stops to explain the terms they're using when they're speaking. But when it's in the narrative, there are often ways where you can kind of sneak in a little bit of explication, some more context than the original might have had. One thing that is really frowned upon in English translations, although not in all languages, is footnoting terms in fiction. And we tried never to do that. And in every book I've ever translated, there's not been a single footnote, at least in novels, in fiction. And I'm actually working on a translation now of a novel where I think for the first time I am going to use some footnotes, and it's because the author uses footnotes in the original, and it's a very meta fictional kind of book where there's lots of talk about what writing is, and there's kind of layers upon layers of stories. So I've been given permission by the author and by myself, I think, to actually use footnotes. But every time I do it, I feel like, it's this huge transgression, because among translators, it's just considered like an admission of failure. Like, oh, you couldn't figure out a way to explain this term, so you have to put a footnote in.
It's so interesting.
Yeah.
Right. Whereas in some fields, like I'm a historian, in some fields, it's like if you don't footnote things, it's as if you haven't done the work to have a lot of backstory that show, it's always about showing how much of the extra research you can pack into the footnotes.
Yeah, and in some cultures, evidently, they look at it very differently. I was at a residency program with a group of translators. We were all, this is actually around Judith Rosenbaum's book, All the Rivers, which you mentioned before. A group of us who were all translating it into our respective languages. We spent a few days in Jerusalem at this cultural center with Judith, the author, and we discussed, all kinds of issues about the translation. And I remember when there was some term that came up that everyone was struggling with, how do we do it in this language? And someone said, I think it might have been Judith, who said, well, couldn't you put a footnote? And we all kind of gasped, like, no, never. But the French translator said, oh yes, of course. My translators are full of footnotes, and the French readers expect it, and they don't find that it, holds them up or anything. So it's just a question of conventions in different cultures.
Do you ever come across cultural references? I mean, you don't live in Israel now, so do you come across any cultural references that you're not familiar with?
Yeah, it does happen for sure. Sometimes it happens with current, slang, because Hebrew grows so quickly, and a word that might have been used in kind of street slang last year isn't used anymore. Now there's something new. I do tend, usually I've at least heard it, even if I don't fully understand the context in which you would say it, because I talk to people, I listen to the radio, I read stuff, I watch TV series, so I'm pretty keyed in, and I spend usually a couple of months there every year when we are not in the middle of a pandemic. And then more often than that, though, it will be older terms that I may not be familiar with, historical figures or incidents that I'll have to look up, and sometimes I really struggle to find things. But that's rare, because there's just so much information available online now. It's just astonishing what you can find if you dig deep enough. But I do a lot of research sometimes, and I go down rabbit holes that sometimes hours later I kind of emerge from, and I think, oh, I actually haven't done any work today because I've been busy reading about some hotel owner in Jaffa who, just like all kinds of life stories of these interesting figures that come up in a book I'm translating. So that does happen.
I can imagine. And you sort of anticipated my next question, which was about Hebrew as a language. Language is obviously always changing in every language, but Hebrew feels particularly creative, and also is such an interesting language because it's ancient, but also very recently really revived for daily use. And whenever you're, anyone who's using Hebrew is often playing with the biblical and religious allusions, but also it can be used very much as a contemporary secular kind of language. The Academy of Hebrew Language is always actively creating words. I actually follow them on Instagram. It's a great account if anyone is interested in Hebrew. So how do you think about, capturing that essential sort of Hebrewness of Hebrew in your translations? And do you encounter many different kinds of Hebrew? How do you deal with that balance between, if an Israeli is reading something, they would probably, well, maybe not so much anymore, but they might understand that there's that layer of religious allusion there, even if it's a secular text, those things coexist. How do you convey that in English?
Yeah, it's difficult. That's definitely one of the biggest challenges. Some writers in particular are really, really kind of wizards at this. I would say David Grossman more than anyone else at, having just these pretty wild swings between, biblical language and very current slang in the same sentence sometimes, and just, hugely different registers that work in Hebrew. And I've never quite figured out why it is that Hebrew just seems more tolerant of those discrepancies. And when I try to get that into English, it just doesn't sound right. It's very difficult to find, the correct register, let alone have two clashing registers right next to each other in the same sentence. So that is a huge challenge. I don't really know what the solution is. Again, it's kind of a case-by-case basis. And I have to hear, is this working? But yeah, it's Hebrew in general is a very pliable language, both in the sense that it absorbs lots of other languages. So I'm not sure if I've translated a single book that didn't have at least one other language somewhere in it, whether it's Arabic, English, Yiddish, any other number of languages. And then the question is, well, what do you do in the translation? Do I retain that in the foreign language? An Israeli can be expected to understand the occasional Arabic word or Yiddish. An English language reader, not so much. So that's a question I always have to grapple with. And then Hebrew is also pliable in that it's quite easy to invent words in Hebrew. And that's why the Academy that you mentioned, that's what they do. They sit around inventing words, and because they're needed. And you can do it in Hebrew. Those of you who know a little bit of Hebrew might know that almost every Hebrew word is based on what's called a root and a pattern, or a building, is what they're literally called in Hebrew. So if an author invents a word using a semantic root and then a grammatical pattern, even if you've never encountered that word before because they made it up, you would know what it means. But inventing words in English is not that easy, and being guaranteed of having your readers understand it. So that's a whole different thing, which I often encounter.
That is interesting. I want to ask a little bit about some of the kind of politics of translation and the identity politics of it, which for people who follow translation, there's been a lot of controversy recently around this, particularly around the translations of the poet Amanda Gorman, who spoke at the inauguration this year. And Gail asked this question as well for us in the chat. How do you think about, you translate both male and female writers. Is the experience different for you? How do you think about sort of the identity piece of translation?
Yeah, I have been thinking about that a lot recently because of the Amanda Gorman controversy, which was just so incredible in the kind of little translation community. I know that it leaked out of that community too, because it was covered in the New York Times and the Washington Post and all over the world. But there's a Facebook group that I'm on of literary translation, and it was just blowing up, and things got to the point where people were kind of storming off the group, or whatever the virtual version of that is, and people getting really, really worked up about it. To be perfectly honest, it's not something that preoccupies me that much. I mean, I think I could envision a situation in which I wouldn't be comfortable translating a book of someone who had opinions that I found offensive, or that really go against my principles. But other than that, I look at the text, I look at the book, and I read it, I experience it, and I think about what kind of effect it has on me. I don't really think all that much about the identity, gender, or other of the author. Now, that said, because I do have the luxury of being able to pick and choose pretty much, I would say that all things being equal, I would rather translate women authors, because I think that they have not been given a center stage for so long. I would rather translate Mizrahi authors. There are Palestinian authors who write in Hebrew. So yeah, if that were just kind of a free choice that I had to make, I probably would gravitate towards minorities. I mean, women are not minorities, but women and minorities. In practice, there are authors who I'm committed to and who send me work, and many of them are male, and I'm happy to translate them. So yeah, it just really depends on the particular book.
Also, on the theme of the politics of translation, obviously who gets translated is, has to do with politics. And as we know, we see, especially, it seems to me, I mean, I guess the other cultural literature that I read is Hebrew, and English mostly. But and those authors are primarily the ones that we know of here, that the ones that are readily available tend to be men, and tend to be men from Ashkenazi and like fairly prominent Ashkenazi families. So which writers in Hebrew are not getting translated but we should know about?
Well, I'll mention one in particular because it's become very relevant to me recently, is a writer called Leah Aini. Aini. She's not well known outside of Israel. She's had virtually nothing translated. And she is one of the, in my opinion, personally, one of the best writers, most interesting writers in Israel. And, she's pretty widely critically acclaimed. She's not an easy writer. She's not a very commercial writer, but she does have quite a big following in addition to being, well reviewed. And her masterpiece, and I don't use that word lightly, is an autobiographical novel called Rose of Lebanon, which I have been involved with for about a decade now, since it came out. And I actually just this week was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship to translate this novel. So I'm not trying to toot my own horn, but I'm just so excited because this is something I've wanted to do for a long time. It's a very long, very difficult novel. The author is not in a position to pay for the translation. And I've been kind of for years now trying to make this happen, and it just finally did this week. So that's why I'm talking up this book. So Rose of Lebanon, it's going to be probably a couple of years before it's actually out in English. And we still need to find a publisher. And that's another aspect of your question is, it's all very well to find books to translate and to translate them. The question is how to publish them. Publishing is, not in a good place right now. Smaller publishers are getting bought up by big conglomerates where the bottom line is the only thing that matters. And people want bestsellers, and a lot of good quality literature is never going to be a bestseller. So, and there are also cultural moments, and I think Israel has had its moments, and right now it's very, very difficult to find publishers who are interested in contemporary Israeli fiction. I think probably the case will be now that it actually is easier to sell women and minority authors from Israel, just because that is where America is now culturally. I mean, finally, I should say. So perhaps that will mean that we do get to hear more different voices. But the reality is, and I guess I'm complicit in that, is that, as you mentioned, the kind of big stars of Israeli literature who succeed in the States or in the English language world are mostly Ashkenazi men. That's true.
Right. I had another question that was related to this, which now just flew out of my head. But, well, I guess one, and someone asked this in the chat as well, you said you've been working on this one for a long time. How many projects do you work on concurrently? I'm curious how you do that.
Too many. I don't generally have, I'm almost never working on more than one book at a time. Occasionally I've done that when it's been two really different books, like just very different voices or fiction and nonfiction. But as a rule, I try not to do that because I just don't have the brain capacity to spread myself that thin. But I often will, if I'm working on a novel, especially if it's something that's quite long or difficult, I might take on other smaller things to kind of give myself a break every so often. So, just a couple of weeks ago, I got approached by a very young writer who I didn't know anything about. He's better known as a poet. And he just said, hey, I have these short stories. Are you interested in translating them? Now, I don't really have the time to do that. I have, projects booked up for the next 2 years. But one of the stories I just really liked. It was fun. And I thought, this will be a nice break from the other stuff I'm doing. It won't take long. So I like to kind of go back and forth between a couple things. But as a rule, I usually have one novel, which I will work on from anywhere from 6 months to a year, sometimes, depending on how long it is. And a lot of novel translations are never quite done. I send them in, but then several months later, I'll get the proofs to read, and there's a whole editorial process. And so it can take a long time. American publishing is quite slow, so there's always just multiple stages for a book to go through, which I usually try to be involved in.
That makes sense. And this is I'll ask this last question, which is a little bit silly, but I'm curious whether you think that the recent prominence of Israeli TV in the States will have an impact on the translation of Hebrew literature.
That's a good question. I think, there is some just fantastic Israeli TV. I'm sure many of you have seen some of the shows. And that's actually something that I've been translating is pitches and synopses for new shows, because Israel is so hot right now in TV. Everyone's trying to get in on that. So I'm often asked to translate, proposals for American studios and Israeli shows. Will that have an effect on literature? I don't know. I'm not sure if I can really answer that, but I suspect no. I don't think I think most of the literature that gets translated and published, there's not much of a crossover really with that, but I might be wrong. I hope I'm wrong.
Well, thank you so much, Jessica, for giving us insight into your process and into Matalon's book, helping us gain a perspective on both Israeli literature and on the process of translation. And I very much look for. Oh, I didn't ask you what you're working on now. What we should be keeping our eyes out for. I mean, Rose of Lebanon, sure, that will be coming down in a few years. But is there something we can look forward to more sooner?
Well, what you can all look forward to is David Grossman's new novel, which is coming out at the end of summer, I think towards the end of August. It's called More Than I Love My Life. And it's a really interesting book. It's the first time he's ever written a fiction that's based on a true life story. It's the life story of a woman who was a friend of his for many years and who has really just an incredible story. I don't want to give it away, but he kind of fictionalized her story, and it's a really great novel. So that'll be out in the summer.
Wonderful. Well, we look forward to reading your next translation, and I've enjoyed so many of your translations. So thank you for bringing so much beautiful work to life in English.
Thank you. I appreciate you saying that, and thank you for everyone who turned up. And I hope you read the book and enjoy it.
Yes, absolutely. Everyone should read Ronit Matalon and keep an eye out for all of Jessica's beautiful translations. And all of you, thank you for being here. I hope you'll all join us next week, same time, same place, for a special quarantine book talk in honor of National Poetry Month, a conversation with the poets Joy Layden, Leslie Newman, and Shara McCallum. We'll be talking about writing and reading poetry, the power of poetry in these challenging times. I know I've been reading a lot more poetry this year than I ever have before, and I think that's true of many people, so I hope you'll be with us. In the meantime, I encourage you to check out the many, many resources that we have in our digital archive at jwa.org. So much material to discover, help you learn about the diversity of the Jewish story. If you enjoyed our conversation tonight, you might want to check out our podcast interview with Dorit Rabinyan on the novel All the Rivers, which I believe Betsy put in the chat a little bit ago. Jessica also translated that novel. It was wonderful to be with you all tonight. Until next time, be well and have a great rest of the week. Take care, everybody.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you. Bye-bye.